This is called Freddie Swings In. And I don't know how dark this is, we'll see. But there is a death that in this story that might raise my hardness. Okay, here it is. Freddie Swings In. Every morning I would lie in bed and listen to my neighbor dress for work. She was so close and the walls were so thin that I could hear laundered cotton against her skin and her voice humming to the radio. Her sad songs of Latino love drifted through my room on the aroma of warm corn tortillas, and I closed my eyes and imagined she was my wife. And soon I would wake our children and walk them to school, nodding to the old women in the plaza as we passed. On my way home, I would stop to talk about the weather with the old men in the cafe, and maybe play a game of dominoes in the shade. Then I would open my eyes to the cracked plaster ceiling of my apartment, and I was back where I was, which was nowhere. When he asked me, I thought it was Bob's little joke, so I laughed and said, "I'm not a killer, Bob." "Yeah, I know," Bob said, "but you've hurt people." There's a difference. Fracture is more like incentive for people to pay. Yeah, an incentive for people to pay what they owe. People can't pay what they owe when they're not breathing, Bob. That's just bad business. I paused, hoping the logic would change the flow of this conversation. Bob nodded, chewing it over. Okay, point taken. He sipped a red wine and touched his napkin to his lips. So if it makes you feel better, think of this as an incentive for others to pay. He sat very still and stared at me, his hands in his lap with his napkin. I grew up making collections and deliveries for Bob, so I knew that look. It meant negotiations were over. The subject was closed. Resigned, I said, "When do you want this?" "Sometime this week." I nodded. "That gives me time." "Time for what?" "To pray I get hit by a truck," I said. "You want some advice? Don't think about it." He squeezed my forearm. "Just step in and do it quick." "Thanks, Bob, for the advice." Bob leaned back in his chair and watched me. "Aren't you curious about who?" Yeah, I guess so, Bob." "Freddie. I need you to do Freddie Bolin." I felt weightless, like it was just me and Bob in space floating around that restaurant. I knew Freddie. We weren't friends exactly, but we sometimes had a beer up near Lincoln Center, and one thing I knew, Freddie was harmless. Freddie usually rolled in around 4, ahead of the crowd, and if I was there, he'd have me read whatever he'd written that day. I didn't mind, although the plots were always the same. The hero swung in on a shoelace, dispatched the bad guys, and rescued the blonde with the pouty lips. The women were always blonde, even the Asians, and as far as I could tell, none of them wore underwear ever. Freddie was older than me, in his 40s, wore pancake to hide acne scars, and he batted for the other team. I knew this, although he never hit on me, and I appreciated his sensitivity to my hetero persuasion. The closest he came to making a pass was when I told him his hero was too honest and strong to be believable. Freddie looked at me over his Chardonnay and said, "I based him on you, Jake. He's you. I hope that's okay." So I knew that killing Freddie couldn't be anything but bad. Bad for Freddie and bad karma-wise for me. It started the minute I stepped out. A cab stopped. I got in and swear to God, I had to give the driver lessons on getting around Manhattan. I explained how 5th Avenue divides the city east and west and how 6th is the Avenue of Americas, and that big green thing, the thing with all the fucking trees, that's called Central Goddamn Park. Then he made a wrong turn on 26th, got stuck behind a schmata cart, and by the time I made my first appointment, I was in a mood that could alter weather patterns in Brazil. Bob had sent me out to collect from a piano player who bet heavy on college hoops and lost. Bob wanted me to break her finger, one of the little ones, as a reminder of her obligations. The piano player lived in a 4th-floor walk-up on 9th. I climbed the steps, heavy with the weight of Freddie on my mind, and knocked on her door. She let me in, all nervous, and started in on why she didn't have the money. Her place was nice, the furniture and all, but the air was so thick you could have knitted it into a stink sweater, all because of an evil yellow Tom with one good eye. I was in negotiations with the piano player when the Tom backed up against my coach bag, looked me right in the eye, and empties his rat bladder on $400 worth of tanned leather. The piano player, joy in her heart, said, "He's making water." I can see that. He had crystals in his urethra. Looks like he's over it. I took him in yesterday, she said, to the vets. They put in a catheter. Jesus, I said, conjuring up a mental image I did not want to see. It cost $300. I blinked, more stunned by the amount than by the ammonia. You spent $300 so your cat could piss on my bag? Well, he was blocked, she said. Excuse me for saying this, but I'm about to break a finger here, one of the little ones, in lieu of currency, 300 of which could postpone this unpleasantness for both of us another week. Seeing as how cats are, disposable pets, I don't see the logic. But Mr. Chumley was uncomfortable, she said. No, I said, this is uncomfortable. I scooped up the fat Tom in one hand and tossed him out the window. I like to think that he had a new look in his eye, possibly one of regret, but I know cats, and I know he was giving me the evil eye all the way down to the hard landing on 9th. I looked out, and Mr. Chumley, too nasty to die, was staggering toward the curb, but a passing cab thumped him, and that was that. The piano player's hands flew to her face, and she started to cry. I softened, I guess, and I said, "Look, I'll cover the vig this week with Bob, just to show you I'm sorry I had to do that." I put my hand in my pocket. Now, do yourself a favor and get some help. The way you gamble is not, healthy long term. I dropped a few bills onto her coffee table and got some air freshener. And I said, "And get some air freshener, huh?" My eyes are burning. I let myself out. That night, I sat in the dark in my apartment and listened to my neighbor cook dinner. She sang a sad song about broken hearts. Her voice rose above the traffic noise and took me to a warm place where I smelled beans and chilies and the evening rain as it stirred the dust of the plaza. On Tuesday, Bob handed me a black valise that held the week's receipts. "Don't let a cat pee on this, huh? There's 43 large in there." A shadow must have crossed my face. Bob leaned in and said, "You thinking about Freddie?" I nodded. "Today?" "Yeah, today." "That's good," Bob said. "Believe me, you'll sleep better once it's done." I didn't think I'd ever close my eyes again. Freddie Boland was a bad writer, sure, but if that was a capital crime, you couldn't walk down the street without tripping on poets, playwrights, and dead ad guys. Bob pushed a crumpled paper bag across the table. It held something heavy. "I got you something," Bob said. I looked inside and saw a small caliber automatic, foreign made. I nodded again, but not because I agreed with anything. After I dropped the money off with O'Connell, I caught a cab back to my apartment. I took the little .32 out of the bag and broke it down. I cleaned it and wiped each piece, including the magazine and bullets, before putting it back together. I dropped it into my pocket and walked up to Freddie's place. I felt like I was walking through wet cement. Freddie buzzed me in. "I was expecting you," he said. "You know why I'm here?" Freddie shrugged. "Things get around." Freddie took a seat on a sofa sagging under stacks of newspapers, magazines, and manuscripts. He leaned forward, his fingers hanging between his knees like ripe plantains. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm sorry you have to do this." "You know why?" Freddie said, "I owe some money." "How much money?" Freddie shook his head. "Too much, almost 30 grand to Jimmy Marbles." "Geez, Freddie." "I know," Freddie said, "I know. And when Jimmy wants his money," Freddie shrugged and looked out at the window, "I kind of threatened him." The hair on my neck stood up. Threatened him? With what? "I know some stuff. I found out about a girl Jimmy killed over in Queens." I couldn't believe this. No one could be dumb enough to threaten Jimmy Marbles, not even Freddie. Freddie looked back at me, a half smile on his face. Not too smart, huh? I blew out a big sigh. Freddie, you put me in a very awkward position. I took my gloves from my pocket. Freddie got up from the sofa. No sense dragging this out. He turned around, his back to me, and hunched his shoulders up around his ears. Go ahead, he said. I pulled on the gloves, and when the latex snapped, Freddie said, you going to shoot me or check my prostate? I racked around into the chamber and picked up a throw pillow to muffle the shot. I aimed at the small bald spot at the top of Freddie's head. Freddie said, his voice in a whisper, aren't you worried that somebody might hear? I thought about this and the thin walls in my place and said, maybe we should take this outside. Freddie nodded and said, I'll get my coat. The next morning, Bob asked how it went. It went, I said. Haven't heard anything about the body. Give it a couple days, they'll find him. Good, Bob said. But he looked nervous, like maybe he was getting pressure from Jimmy Marbles. Bob gave me the bag again and made a joke about not running off to Mexico with all that money, but it wasn't funny, and the joke died away like a bad smell. Instead of catching a cab downtown to O'Connell's, I crossed the street and headed uptown to 66th, where I went down into the subway and crossed over to the southbound platform. There was a big crowd drawn to a show at Lincoln Center. I put myself between a man in a suit and a woman with a small boy. I looked across the platform, and there, leaning against the wall, was Freddie. He smiled at me, and I nodded. I had Bob's black valise, and Freddie had his suitcase. We waited for the train. You! Her voice rose above the racket of the Manhattan Underground. Then I saw her face bunched up, angry as scuffed knuckles. You bastard! The crowd began to part. The man in the suit backed off to the right. The woman with the boy slid off to the left. The piano player pointed at me with one hand. Her other hand was in her pocket. You killed Mr. Chumley! I glanced around like maybe she was talking to someone else. I've been looking everywhere for you, she said. She took her hand out from her pocket. In it was a gun. She fired a shot that zinged by my ear and scattered the crowd, the crack echoing off the tile. From the tunnel came the building roar of a train, its wheels squealing with the same high voltage intensity as the shrieks of the people around me. The piano player fired again, and this one bore into the fabric of my jacket, creasing my shoulder. A soft shape moved toward the shooter against the rushing human tide. The piano player turned toward him, her gun hand trailing behind. Freddie, his head down, a few steps away, was moving fast, and his arms were stretched out to gather her in. The train blew through the tunnel. From the tunnel, the piano player brought the pistol around and fired at Freddie. The roar drowned out the shot and the people's screams. The piano player fired again, but Freddie's momentum carried him into her. I watched her fold over his shoulder. I watched the gun fall from her hand and bounce off the concrete. I felt the squeal and rumble shake every atom of the station. Then the piano player and Freddie were gone, lost over the platform's edge. The train slammed through, unable to stop. People screamed and surged toward the stairs. I let myself be carried up and outside into the sunlight of 66th Street. I never sleep. I lie on my cot and listen, but the walls are too thick for me to hear my neighbors sing. I follow the pattern of the plaster above me, and I imagine the workman who made those strokes, and I wonder if he has a wife who brings him cool drinks in the evening. Before the 1 o'clock rains, I dress and walk to the bodega. The women nod and call me senor. I take a small table in the shade. The waiter, one of the bravest men in the village, brings me a beer. I ask if there have been any strangers in town, and he says no. I choose to believe him because he stands close by, waiting for my order. I sit beneath hanging baskets of flowers. I ask the waiter what kind of flowers they are, but it's either my Spanish that's insufficient or his knowledge. Either way, he does not answer. He does not know, and he smiles in apology. Their petals fall, as red as blood, and land on the backs of my hands. I touch the pistol beneath my shirt, its grip already slick with sweat, and I hum a sad song as if the music will somehow rewrite my life. A warm breeze blows across the plaza, and as I wait for them to come, I smell warm corn tortillas and dust, and the 1 o'clock rains as they begin to dot the leaves of the surrounding trees. Thank you.